Hey everyone, so for my experiment, I'll be doing the little Albert experiment. This experiment was done by John B. Watson and Rosalie Raynor, and it took place in Johns Hopkins University in February of 1920. And there were two objectives for the study. One of them was to demonstrate that all human behavior stems from learning and conditioning, and the other was to demonstrate that the Freudian concept of psychology, psychoanalysis, that our behavior stems from unconscious processes was wrong. Before I discuss the experiment in general, I want to first discuss the societal climate at the time that this experiment took place. We had just got done with World War I, and we're slowly but surely trying to inch our way back to a normal way of life. Unfortunately, there were many events that not let us do that. The first I want to discuss is the first Red Scare, which occurred between 1917 and 1920. This occurred right after World War I. And it was when we had first become fearful of communism and anarchists. And more specifically in the United States, labor strikes were on the rise, and the press sensationalized them as being caused by immigrants bent on bringing down the American way of life. More specifically, Americans were conditioned to fear a certain group of people. And this led to the Red Summer of 1919, which was when white supremacist terrorist attacks against African Americans took place. Again, Americans were conditioned to fear a certain group of people. And I'm not saying that these historical events are what directly influenced Watson to do this experiment, but what I am saying is it's very interesting how similar they are to his experiment. And as far as the academic climate goes, psychoanalytic view of human behavior as explored by Freud was very popular. Many psychologists believe this, as well as the public in general, that our emotions come from internal processes. And behaviorism, as was explored by Watson in this experiment, as well as Pavlov, another famous psychologist, was not really explored at the time. And it was a very new concept. And going back to the historical events, the societal and academic themes that were prevalent were behaviorism, and again, going back to the events, conditioned behavior, more specifically fear. And why were researchers interested? Well, as I explained, it was a revolutionary view. Behaviorism was really explored at that time, and society was not ready to accept these ideas. Many people were very in favor of Freud's view, and Watson wanted to prove Freud wrong. As far as influences for the study goes, Watson did reference a study that he did with J.J.B. Morgan in this paper, which was titled Emotional Reactions and Psychological Experimentation, which was quite similar to the Little Albert experiment, and it actually influenced him to do the Little Albert experiment. And I want to also discuss Freud again because Watson was so bent on proving Freud wrong. As far as the experiment goes, Watson had 4 parts to his hypothesis. Number 1, can you condition fear of an animal by visually presenting it and simultaneously striking a bar? Number 2, if a condition or emotional response is established, will the fear transfer to other animals and other objects? Number 3, what is the effect of time upon these responses? And number 4, can you recondition the responses? Method. At first, Albert was presented with these objects just as they were, just to see if he had initial fear of them. He did not. In fact, with many of the objects, he wanted to touch them because he was very interested and intrigued by them. After these objects were presented, Watson took a steel bar and struck it. This, of course, frightened little Albert. Albert was then later on presented with the white rat and the steel bar at the same time, which frightened him. These occurred 3 times. 1 week later, the same procedure happened. After 7 pairings, Albert was shown the white rat just by itself, and he became fearful of it, meaning that the fear response had become conditioned. And Watson and Raynor wanted to see if these responses could be generalized to a similar object, more specifically a white rabbit, and they were very right about that. He became also fearful of the white rabbit, as well as the other objects which I've presented at the beginning of the slide. And they also want to see if these responses could transfer to a different environment, and they moved Albert to a different room with more lighting and more people. And he had the same responses, but they were less intense. And they also wanted to see if these responses would persist over time. So after a month, they did these same experiments, and again, Albert was still very much afraid of these. And as far as the findings go, Watson did prove that emotional behavior could be shown through experimental means. Going back to his hypothesis, can you condition fear of an animal by visually presenting it with striking still bar? The answer is yes. If such conditioned responses can be established, will there be generalization to other animals and other objects? Yes. What is the effective time upon such conditioned emotional responses? The answer is, of course, little to none, as was shown when he was shown these objects a month after these had initially occurred. And number 4 is interesting. If after a reasonable period of such emotional responses have died out, what laboratory methods can be devised for their removal? They initially wanted to see if they could recondition Albert to eliminate his fearful responses. Unfortunately, he was removed from the facility where the experiments were taking place the day that they had finished, so they were never able to do that. But it is interesting to think the potential outcome that could have happened from it. And why were these results interesting at the time? As I discussed, people were very much for Freud's psychoanalytic view, and behaviorism wasn't really considered at the time. And it was interesting because it showed that behavior can be conditioned through outside means as opposed to internal processes. And is it still influential today? Yes. Aside from what I just explained, this experiment can also be simultaneous with phobias. Fearful responses can persist over time, which is in essence what phobias are. We saw it through when Albert was not shown the objects for a month, and then he was again and still had the same fearful responses. While it is a very influential study, there are criticisms for it. It obviously violates many ethical standards that we have today, and since Albert was never reconditioned, as was showed through the previous slide, fearful responses can persist over a long period of time, meaning Albert very well could have had the same fearful responses throughout his entire lifespan, which is very unfortunate. And lastly, why is it regarded as being influential in modern psychology? Well, it helped launch one of the major schools in psychology, behaviorism. It's more straightforward than Freud's psychoanalytic view was. And to go along with that, it showed that emotional disturbance in adulthood cannot always be attributed to sexual trauma in childhood, which is what Freud talked about. And these are my references. Thank you.